My name is Paula Marks, and I'm going to introduce our two presenters, and we will have some time after they have made their presentations for questions and comments. So our first presenter is Philis Barragan, Goetz, and she is an assistant professor of history at Texas A&M University in San Antonio, here in San Antonio. She teaches classes in Mexican American history, women's history, Texas history, and U.S. social and cultural history. Philis is the Texas A&M University's San Antonio Community Liaison to the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum, which has this huge long acronym. In this capacity, she directs a student internship and works with the organization's director to research San Antonio's African American history. Her manuscript, Reading, Writing, and Revolution, Esqueletas and the Emergence of Mexican American Identity in Texas, is under contract with the University of Texas Press. And I think if it's okay with you all, I'll go ahead and do both introductions, and then we can just move straight into Bill's after Philis's. You saw Philis coached me on Barragan, but I still had stumbled a bit and almost forgot her last name. Sorry about that. Okay. Bill Bush is an associate professor of history at Texas A&M University, San Antonio, where he teaches classes on modern U.S. history and the history of children and youth. He has published 2 books, Who Gets a Childhood? Race and Juvenile Justice in 20th Century Texas from University of Georgia in 2010, and Circuit Riders for Mental Health, the Hogg Foundation in 20th Century Texas, Texas A&M University, 2016. His co-edited volume, Ages of Anxiety, Historical and Transnational Perspectives on Juvenile Justice, will be published this summer by New York University Press. Currently, Bill is working on a new project titled Future Dangerousness, Childhood, and the Death Penalty in Modern America, supported in part by a research grant from the Texas State Historical Association. I think you all would agree before we even hear these folks speak that they're doing some very important cutting-edge work. So we look forward to, as I said, learning from them. So please welcome Philis.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the panel. So my portion of the presentation is going to be focused on the history of African American education in San Antonio in the post-Civil War era. And so just some things I'd like you all to keep in mind as I progress through the slides and we move forward with the narrative is the tension between the federal government and local governments, the struggle between these two governmental bodies over who would be the one to educate African American children? Whose responsibility is it? So please keep that in mind. And then also we're going to be talking about the corollaries of that struggle, right? The consequences, which ultimately is institutionalized segregation in various forms. So just a kind of a brief little overview introduction. The Civil War was from 1861 to 1865. And the period immediately following the Civil War was known as Reconstruction, which was a period in which the federal government, under the control of the Republican Party, was trying to literally reconstruct the nation, right? Bring the nation back together at the end of the Civil War. And one of their programs, they had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? 13th Amendment abolished slavery, 14th Amendment established citizenship rights for former slaves, and the 15th Amendment more explicitly dealt with voting rights. And so part of their larger project of Reconstruction was the creation of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, which was more commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau had kind of 3 major tasks. We could kind of sum them up into 3 categories. One was negotiating labor contracts between former slaves and white landowners. The second was conducting marriage ceremonies and offering aid to the freedmen in legal aid for whatever they might have needed. And most importantly for our purposes here, it was opening up schools for Black children. There were some cases where the Bureau opened up and operated and oversaw the function of a school itself, But in other cases, there were times where African Americans opened up their own schools, and then the Bureau offered them aid, like kind of supplemented the work that these African American citizens were already doing. So in 1870, there were 56 schools in Texas that African Americans had opened themselves. And of those 56 schools, 34 of them were receiving some type of aid or support from the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, as these images illustrate, the Freedmen's Bureau had a very polarizing presence, and its arrival in San Antonio was actually no different. But if you take a look at the slide on the left, you have, it was from Harper's Weekly in 1868, where you have angry and armed whites on one side, angry armed blacks on the other side, and the person in the middle, the peacemaker, of course, is the Freedmen's Bureau agent. And then also note the US flag that's kind of right behind the Freedmen's Bureau agent. And then the second picture is from an 1866 gubernatorial election in Pennsylvania. And you can see the depiction of African Americans and being very critical of their both emancipation and then enfranchisement. So in March of 1866, the Bureau opened up the Lincoln School. It was called the Lincoln School here in San Antonio. And they opened it up in the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. And the church actually had just opened up that same year. So the Lincoln School offered day classes and it offered night classes. It had some trouble hiring teachers initially. The first teacher that this Lincoln School hired was a guy named Mr. Gordon. He was a white man, and he was operating a prostitution hall not that far from the school, filled with black women. And so because of his activities, the Bureau had some trouble maintaining its student population. There were lots of families that just left or refused to patronize the school. So the Bureau ended up dismissing Mr. Gordon, and in his place, they hired a white woman from the north who had come to San Antonio to work in the Bureau school, and her name was Sarah Skinner. And before long, they hired an additional white woman from the north. Her name was Annie Nahar, and Nahar ended up becoming headmistress of the Bureau school. And so there were some prominent black Republicans in the city. A couple of them I'll give you by name because their names are going to come up again. Nance Duval was one, and Fayette Walker. And when Nahar was headmistress, these two gentlemen had a big role in the functioning, just the day-to-day functioning of the school, trying to help Nahar with whatever she needed for the kids. Now, the school was controversial for many reasons, one of which was you have this situation where white teachers are instructing black pupils. And so opponents of Reconstruction claimed that these teachers were promoting racial integration and social equality, and that these women teachers were more than likely very promiscuous. And additionally, opponents argued that these Bureau schools was really just a front for these northern teachers who were trying to spread Republican influence even further. Now, the Republicans, on the other hand, argued that having white teachers was actually a way for them to maintain control over the black population, right? The Republicans were not interested in social equality and racial integration the way the opposing party had claimed. Now, eventually, because of all this controversy over the role of these white teachers, eventually the Bureau school ended up hiring a black teacher, Nance Duval, who was a prominent member of the black community here in San Antonio. So, as a result of all of this controversy, all of these criticisms, the city council then ended up opening up a school for blacks that was supposed to rival the Lincoln School. So the purpose of the first black school that the San Antonio City Council opened was to rival this Freedmen's Bureau school, right? Because they didn't like the Republican influence. So, let's see. Oh, sorry. So, the rival school that the city founded was called the Rincon School. It opened in 1871. It had between 100 and 170 students its first year. That's a photograph of it in the top left. Many black patrons of the Lincoln School were intimidated and pressured into sending their children to the Rincon School instead. But this kind of schism between these two schools goes beyond just, federal government versus local government. The Black community itself played a role in this whole debate because there was controversy about the fact that the Bureau was using the colored Methodist Episcopal property to house its school. And so in the midst of all this debate, Nance Duval, remember, he was the first Black teacher that the Lincoln School hired, and he initially was a very big supporter of the Bureau School. But Nance Duval ended up leaving the Lincoln School, and he became the only Black instructor at the Rincon School. Other prominent members of the Black community, such as Fayette Walker, whom I also mentioned earlier, remained a supporter of the Lincoln School. So the Black community in San Antonio itself is divided between these two schools. Eventually, though, or within a fairly short period of time, the number of students attending the Rincon School declined rather sharply, so that eventually the school just closed. Now, the controversies surrounding the Lincoln and the Rincon schools were part of larger tensions within the Republican Party itself. Up to this point, African American political positions depended heavily on white Republican patronage, right? White Republicans backing them, basically. And many members of the Republican Party began to take the African American vote for granted. White Republicans never allowed Black Republicans to hold any position of power within the party, and they expected them basically to do whatever they were told to do. So many African Americans within the party began having these discussions about, maybe this really isn't the party for us. Maybe we should start becoming independent voters because we're not respected within our own political party. There was this guy named James Newcomb. He was a Republican Party leader within the state. He was editor of the San Antonio Light here in town. And in one conversation with one of his African American Republican colleagues, he said, "My appeal to you is unnecessary," right? Like me saying, "Please stay," or "Let's try to work this out." It's unnecessary. Your gratitude is too fresh, your past slavery too recent, to fear that you will desert your friend and protector, the Republican Party, right? That was James Newcomb's response to the fact that there were prominent African American citizens questioning their presence within the Republican Party. But not all Blacks agreed with him. Richard Nelson founded the Galveston Spectator in 1871, and that was the first Black newspaper published in the state. It didn't last beyond 1885, though, because the paper suffered from some financial problems. But in February of 1884, the San Antonio Light republished one of Richard Nelson's editorials. And in the editorial, Richard Nelson stated, "I'm not opposed to white Republicans, and don't draw any color line. I draw the line of justice, and you call it a color line. Let us first establish justice and equality within the ranks of the Republican Party within our state, and then demand justice and equality from our political opponents." Now, in the same editorial that was published, the Light included their own response to Richard Nelson, and part of their response said, "The proprietors and editors of the Light are of the opinion that if the so-called colored Republicans who claim to be leaders were as earnest and reliable as voters at an election as they are clamorous and noisy about conventions and offices, they might accomplish something. The last election did not prove them a reliable voter. Some of these very loudmouth leaders sold out to the Democratic Committee." And of course, they're referring to the Democratic Party here. So clearly, these internal tensions that are taking place within the Republican Party got rather heated, and it very much influenced the divisions, right, between the Lincoln Bureau School and the Rincon School started by the City Council. But let's kind of talk a little bit about what the Light's response is referring to, particularly in the last line, right, where they sold out to the Democratic Committee. What are they referring to? There were a number of German Americans who, very prominent German American citizens of San Antonio who were members of the Republican Party, and they ended up leaving and forming a coalition with the Democratic Party because they thought that the Republican Party was putting too much emphasis on protecting Black rights, and also the Republican Party wanted the state or federal government to control the local school system, and they didn't agree with either of those things. So some of these prominent men were George W. Brackenridge, Edward Degner, Isaiah and George Pascal, and Mortimer Slocum. Now, these men then, after they sort of defected and left the Republican Party, they approached some prominent members of the black community like Nance Duval and Fayette Walker and another guy named Frank Green about joining them in their efforts to take control over the local public schools, right? So basically saying, hey, the Republican Party is not respecting you. The Republican Party is not treating you well. If you join our alliance, if you join our coalition, we can offer you equality. And not necessarily racial equality, but saying there are black schools, we'll give you control over those black schools. We'll stop hiring white teachers, basically. So more and more blacks then begin voting independently, which means that they become less supportive of the Republican Party. And so these alliances that are taking place in the 1870s and the 1880s really laid the groundwork for special interest, nonpartisan politics in the city of San Antonio, but it's basically the construction of a political machine. So that kind of brings us to the heart of the story here. In April of 1887, the city council voted to appropriate $4,000 to build a new school for black children. The Rincon School, at this point, the Lincoln School's gone. The only school for black children is the Rincon School, the city council school. And it suffered from extreme overcrowding. By 1885, so 2 years before they voted for this $4,000 appropriation, by 1885, there were 405 students enrolled in the school, which had 2 small buildings. And it was the only school available for black children. But despite the fact that the city council addressed the issue, as you can see, this is a photo of the document in the city council minutes. You can see the handwriting is very, very neat. But they say, His Honor the Mayor stated that at the last meeting of the school board, the committee recommended the appropriation of $4,000 for a school building for black children, essentially, right? So despite the fact that they recognized the problem, they voted on a solution to the problem, they actually didn't do anything beyond that. There was never any follow-through. So that's in April of 1887. So in September of 1887, about 5 months later, 45 members of the black community come together and they write a petition to the city council. And the city council did receive this petition. They discussed it because it's also in the minutes, right? It's one sentence in the minutes of that meeting. Colored citizens submitted a petition for an additional school building. And so they basically say that they did make an appropriation. The petition is saying, you city council members did make an appropriation of $4,000 for an additional school, and you haven't done anything with it. But despite the fact that they submitted this petition, the city council still did not do anything about it. So a year later, in September of 1888, a whole year later, 8 of the 45 original signers of that petition in 1887 sent a detailed letter and a copy of the original petition, but a detailed letter to the state superintendent of public instruction, a guy named Oscar H. Cooper. He was in Austin. And in their letter, they state that there were 1,805 black children in the city, and that the Rincon School only had 450 seats. And they talked about how children were being turned away in the morning because there was just no space for them in the school. They talked about how there were more children sitting on the floor, standing in the back, than there were actually children sitting in seats. They said that they had submitted a petition the year before and that the city council had not contacted them and had not done anything. And interestingly, they sent their letter on the letterhead of Carr and Lewis, which was a white law firm in the city. And a few weeks after they sent the letter, Carr and Lewis themselves wrote a letter to Superintendent Cooper stating that these black citizens were, quote, among the best colored citizens in San Antonio, right? We've done some genealogical research on, because we have the names of these black citizens. They were porters. The first black mailman in San Antonio had signed his name to this, so they really were very prominent citizens within their community. And so this is a map. I think this map is stunning. I don't know if you can see it very well, but I love this map. It's a map of all the petitioners' addresses in the city. And you can see they lived throughout the city, right? They're not all segregated to the east side of the city, but they lived throughout the city. And you can see the red arrow, that's where the Rincon School was located. It was called Rincon Street, but today it's called North St. Mary's. It was right on the corner of what today is North St. Mary's and Convent, right at the bend of the San Antonio River. Now, Superintendent Cooper wrote a letter to the City Council of San Antonio, basically saying, what is going on down there? Is it true that you have 1,800 students, but you only have 470 seats? Is it true that you haven't really done anything to help this situation? And so the City Council responded to Superintendent Cooper, and they said, yes, it's true. We do have 1,800 students. And yes, it's true. We do have 470 seats, because that's the number of students that are showing up. Not all 1,800 students are coming to class, so it's actually not that much of a problem. The City Council also said, look, in this letter to Superintendent Cooper, we'll stop turning away students in the morning. We will allow them to stand in the back. We will allow them to sit on the floor. We'll also break the school day up into 2 sessions. We'll have a morning instructional session for 1 group of students, and we'll have an afternoon instructional session for 2 groups of students, so that way we can educate twice the number of kids in 1 day, and we will work on trying to open up more facilities. So what the City Council ended up doing was that they rented a room in the St. James African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was west of San Pedro Creek. So they rented the room for $15 a month. They employed a teacher for $35 a month, and then they hired a janitor for $5 a month, for a total of $55 a month. So this was instead of paying the $4,000 to build a new school. So in 1879, this is kind of going back in time just a little bit. In 1879, the city council built a high school for white children, and many African Americans responded that there was no high school for black children. Black children could not attend school beyond the elementary levels. And it wasn't until 1889 that George Brackenridge provided funding and materials to enhance the curriculum at Rincon School to include high school instruction. So they hadn't yet built a high school. It was basically just augmenting the curriculum that was already at the Rincon School. And the curriculum that was emphasized for African American students was vocational training, right? It was all about, it wasn't classical learning or academics, but it was an industrial education. Now, in 1915, this portion of the Rincon School, that was the high school, was renamed the Frederick Douglass Colored High School. And it was moved to an 8-room building across the street from Mount Zion, which was another was a colored Baptist church. And that was on the east side. So that's when you start to see like the seeds of this residential segregation that kind of sets in. And so this is a page from a graduation program from Frederick Douglass High School in 1931. And you can see that the students received certificates in toilet science. I'm not sure what exactly toilet science is, but toilet science, domestic art, domestic science, and vocational training. So what's the takeaway then? Ultimately, the alliance between with that created this municipal political machine, right? The prominent German Americans who left the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and members of the African American community in town, that coalition that they formed comprised and became this political machine of the city. And the municipal political machine brought more benefits to the African American community in town, like way more benefits than the Republican Party ever did, but it also institutionalized segregation and Jim Crow. Thank you.
Hello. So I also will be discussing schools today, but I will be discussing a very different kind of school than the one that Philis, the type of schools that Philis was discussing. The schools I'll be discussing emerged shortly after the period of the emergence of segregated public schools, and they had a very different relationship to the communities they served. These, of course, are juvenile reform schools. And these are schools that opened in Bexar County in the 1910s. So first, these are schools that were operated by county, not by the city. And they weren't tied to communities or to specific neighborhoods or parts of the city, and they served a very different function. And yet, when they were founded, they promised to offer an education to their students. And their students were all students who had been adjudged as juvenile delinquents in the juvenile courts in San Antonio, which were county courts in the 1910s. The two schools were the Bexar County Training School for Boys, which opened in 1915 in the Southton area, just south of what was then incorporated San Antonio, which today is now part of San Antonio. It's where the Cryer Juvenile Correctional Facility is located in South San Antonio now. And then the Henrietta Jockey Memorial Home for Girls, which I'm going to say a lot more about, which opened in November of 1919 in what was then kind of the northeastern outskirts of San Antonio. So what you see here is actually an image from Chicago, and I apologize for that. I know we're talking about San Antonio today. But I like this image because it conveys the thinking of the reformers who created the juvenile training schools as they became known in the early 20th century. So these schools had a history nationally that traces back to about the 1820s in the United States, when the first reformatories and reform schools opened up in the United States. And they opened up mostly in the northeastern and midwestern United States, and they were mostly based in urban rapidly growing urban metropolitan areas. In the South, you begin to see these schools opening up in the post-Civil War era. And I say schools, they weren't really schools yet, right? They really were more of custodial institutions that put kids to work, essentially. They didn't really offer an education. That would change at the turn of the 20th century. And the thinking that you see in this image, this is an image from a Chicago-based reform organization that assisted ex-convicts, but it captures the thinking of the so-called child savers of the progressive era, who campaigned against child labor, campaigned for compulsory education laws, curfew laws, founded the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, the Boys Clubs and Girls Clubs, promoted playgrounds and supervised recreation for working-class children in urban areas. And the idea was that children were getting in trouble increasingly in urban industrial environments because they weren't receiving appropriate family and community support, right? That they were products of their environment, that they were not products of innate characteristics, and therefore they could be reformed, right? So these same reformers founded settlement houses, for example. Here are a couple of the Texas settlement houses that were founded in the early 20th century. The one on the left is the Rusk Settlement House, which opened in Houston in 1903 in the Buffalo Bayou neighborhood. The one on the lower right is the Mexican Christian Institute in San Antonio, which later became known as the Inman Institute. And these were, of course, community centers that provided services to immigrant families, right? And in those community centers, these reformers encountered a lot of children, right, who needed support. This is a photograph from Lewis Hines' National Child Labor Committee series, a very famous series of photographs of child laborers throughout the United States. This is a photograph from San Antonio of the San Antonio Messengers. And what you see in the caption down here is that he's describing how the San Antonio Messenger boys were often sent into the red light district of San Antonio, and that this was really not a very healthy environment for children, right? So these are the folks who are going to found what becomes really kind of what historians have considered sort of the central achievement of the progressive child savers, and that was the creation of a separate justice system for children and adolescents at the turn of the 20th century, right? And one component of that separate justice system were these schools, these training schools that would offer academic and vocational education. The first of these was founded in Chicago in 1899, and within 20 years, almost every American state has adopted a juvenile court system that includes courts, training schools, detention centers, and juvenile probation, so entirely separate sort of systems for children, right? In Texas, the state of Texas will adopt a juvenile court statute in 1907 that will provide for separate juvenile courts and probation departments, and these are going to get instituted in the cities pretty quickly. Bexar County is going to actually begin holding juvenile court proceedings in the summer and fall of 1907, and the following year they're going to have a voluntary juvenile probation service that's going to become institutionalized as part of the county services in the 19-teens. I'm still not exactly sure what year it becomes instituted. The first minutes that I have are in 1917, which seems kind of late. So this is a movement that's sweeping across the country. And with regard to schools, the idea that they needed to provide an education. Excuse me. This is the training school movement to offer formal education to children who've gotten in trouble. This is a difficult task, right? And especially at the state level where you have statewide institutions as well as ones that are located in urban areas. It's very hard for them to hire teachers. It's very hard for them to hire professionals. As one historian famously put it, when is a school not a school? When it is a school for delinquents. So there is a troubled place of these schools. And one last kind of national contextual point to make here before I start talking more specifically about San Antonio and Bexar County. The reformers who created this system very sort of poignantly articulated ideas about why children and adolescents should not be subject to adult punishments and adult responsibilities and should be subject to more compassionate treatment. They believed they were more vulnerable, more innocent, more salvageable than adults who committed crimes. They spoke eloquently of the malleability of children whose unformed characters, and I'm paraphrasing Ben Lindsay, who's probably the most famous juvenile court judge of the first half of the 20th century, whose unformed characters should not be made to bend to the iron laws that applied to adults. Children were like clay, right? They could be molded. However, as one scholar of African American child-saving social movements has put it, this thinking often did not apply to children of color, either in theory or in practice. And he has coined the idea of hard clay, right, to suggest that that is how reformers, at least in practice, thought of children of color, that they were already formed, right? And so these children are often systematically excluded from these services in some way or another. I'll be talking about what that looks like in San Antonio, at least as far as I can tell. So, San Antonio in the 1910s, it's a rapidly growing city, experiencing major influx of population because of the Mexican Revolution and unrest in Mexico, with extremes of wealth and poverty. Also, of course, a major military center, and we'll see that that figures prominently in the founding of the Girls Reform School, which is founded at the end of World War I. And San Antonio and Bexar County, like many other major American metropolitan areas, is fully in the middle of sort of the progressive project of professionalizing their city government and their city services, right, and creating new sort of professionalized bureaucracies, and that included the advent of this system. And so what you see here on the right are the handwritten minutes of the Bexar County Juvenile Board, which oversaw this system in San Antonio and in Bexar County for decades, basically the entire first half of the 20th century and really into the late 1960s. The first recorded minutes begin in 1917. I should say these books are sitting in a glass case in the Bexar County Juvenile Probation Building. They are not in a library or an archive. There are 3 of these books, and they are incredibly fragile and handwritten for like the first 20 years, so lots of fun to read. The department was initially staffed with grand total of 3 probation officers for the entire Bexar County area. 1 white male, 1 white female, 1 colored probation officer, an attorney named R.A. Campbell, who handled all of the cases of African American kids. And as you can see from the snapshot that I've given you here, African American and Mexican American kids were actually a fair number of the kids who came into their orbit. You'll notice here, this is a snapshot because I don't have systematic statistics. These statistics would be entered into the minutes irregularly. So I would love to be able to present you with a nice tidy table that shows you numbers over a period of 10 years. I can't do that. So here is a snapshot from 1 month, February 1919. And what you see here, of course, what you see on the left is that white Anglo boys and girls are classified as Americans. And then we have Mexican children and Negro children, right? And what you can see on the lower half of the page is then what did they do with kids who came into their orbit? These are kids on the top, the transferred and arrested are kids who have already gone through the court system. So these are what we would call post-dispositional kids. They've already gone through a court proceeding, and now something has to be done with them. And so you see that some boys are being sent to the State Juvenile Training School in Gatesville, which was in North Texas, in between Austin and Waco. It was really kind of a fearsome place, really a place that people didn't want to be sent, and a lot of judges didn't want to send kids there because it had a terrifying reputation, a well-deserved one. The Bexar County one for boys, which had just only been open for about 3.5 years by this time. Most of them are on probation, which means that they are sent back into their community or into their homes, and they're on some kind of supervised probation. But if you look at the girls, there's nowhere for them to be sent, right? There are no public institutions in the city for girls to be sent. There is a state one that opens in 1915. They only accept Anglo girls, right? And it's way up in the Panhandle anyway, so it's really, really far away. Right? So this is a problem, right? This is a real problem that the judges complain about, that communities complain about, and especially because delinquent girls receive a sort of disproportionate amount of attention. They are smaller in number, as you can see here. There's far fewer girls getting in trouble with the system than boys, but they're getting a lot more attention. If you look at the list of the reasons why they are in court, girls are not committing violent crimes or aggressive crimes or crimes that are actual crimes. They are committing more often what we would call status crimes. A status crime is a crime that wouldn't be a crime if you were an adult, like drinking or driving without a license or being out past curfew. Or they are committing what one historian has called the crime of precocious sexuality, right? Or they are acting in some way that is considered gender inappropriate. And so this is a sample list from the same month of the complaints, right? So, right, using vile language, ungovernable is this kind of catch-all category that you see a lot in girls' statistics. In some cases, they actually indicated which girls were committing which offenses, right? So annoying neighbors, that's American girls. Disappearing from home, Mexican, playing truant, Negro, going to picture shows. This is something that they complain about in their meetings quite often, that kids are going to picture shows and to dance halls unaccompanied, which was a problem in a lot of American cities at the time. My favorite thing here is the sequence between pretending to attend school but not, and then not even pretending to attend school. I love that, right? So this is a problem. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. I apologize. All right. There's no place to send the girls. The boys' school is open. The commissioner's court minutes, which I've looked at in talking about this, they really wanted to open a place for girls, but they didn't have the money, right? They're placing girls in the house of the Good Shepherd, or they're having to put them in county jail in the worst case scenario, or worse yet, they're just sending them back into the community, and the community in some cases doesn't want them back, right? So this is a real problem. Enter Alexander Jockey, the department store owner and local philanthropist, who actually had donated to many causes concerning children and will become known particularly not just for philanthropy, but especially for child-centered philanthropy. He dies in 1925, and the Boy Scouts actually had a ceremony at his funeral because he had donated so much money to the local Boy Scouts chapter in San Antonio. Jockey in August of 1918 is going to have a conversation with one of the judges on the county commissioner's court, a guy named James R. Davis, who is telling him about this problem. He's saying, I have like 4, 5, 6 girls a week coming into my court. I don't know what to do with them. We really need to open a home. Can you help us? Right? As he tells the San Antonio Light later, I have no choice but to, quote, turn them back loose on the streets. Right? And so Jockey agrees to donate $15,000, which is the equivalent of about $245,000 in 2018 money. So it's a pretty substantial donation. Now, his only caveat is that it has to be named for his mother, Henrietta Jockey. So hence Henrietta Jockey Memorial Home. The quote there on the left is from Jockey's letter to the commissioner's court promising the money. And right, he understands that it is a crying need for Bexar County. On the bottom are excerpts from the thank you letter from the Commissioner's Court, which was republished in the San Antonio Light, and which very much frames this in the context of the war and patriotism. So there's a lot of sort of references to patriotism and home front concerns about unsupervised girls on the streets of San Antonio, which of course is a major military city. So this is kind of similar to what you see during World War II in a lot of cities that have major defense plants with the so-called victory girls, right? So we're going to have this this facility. So this image will appear in the San Antonio Light in December of 1980. It's an architect's rendering. This is the only image I've been able to find so far of the facility. So I'm assuming it looks like this. I've read all of the sort of construction records and contracts and architects' contracts with the county commissioners, and it seems that they executed this about exactly the way it was envisioned. Right, and this quote here also kind of frames it against the war, right? Here as elsewhere, the war has been the primary cause for the increase, so the sense that there are all these unsupervised teenage girls in the city who are getting into trouble, right? Where was it built? So one of the interesting things about these two training schools is that they were, even though they have these very noble aspirations, the place where they are located is actually they're actually located in really kind of unsavory parts of the city. So the boys' school was built on the former county poor farm, right? And the girls' school was built on land that was formerly devoted to the Live Oak Detention Farm for Diseased Women, right? This is basically a facility for prostitutes and women of ill repute who have come down with syphilis or gonorrhea, right? So that's where they're going to put this beautiful memorial home for girls. Since I am running short on time, I will just say that what I have found preliminarily, and right now what I haven't done yet is I have not done a lot of the kind of genealogical research. So I have some names of some of the kids. I have some names of staff members that I need to kind of dig down into, and I haven't had a chance to do that yet. I've looked at all the commissioner's court records, and I've read all of the juvenile board minutes for like 40 years, and a lot of newspaper articles and a few other things here and there. But I don't have the stories yet that I really want to have for this project, and I will have them. Right now, what I have is a situation where you have a lot of sort of public statements about how wonderful these places are, right, in the 20s and 30s, right, and a few small hints that maybe they're not so wonderful. Now, I've done a lot of work on this subject before, so I know that this is a very common pattern with these kinds of places, that they present themselves as wonderful schools. And, you know, this article here from the Express News in 1921 begins with a story of two 13-year-old boys riding their bikes 10 miles out of downtown San Antonio to the boys' school because it's such a great place. And they want to have some good food, and they've heard from their friends that they have really good food there, and everybody's really nice, right? And I'm reading this going, okay, right? Maybe that's true. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I'm skeptical. One of the reasons I have some ideas about that is that you have these sort of public descriptions of the program, but then you have a constant problem of kids running away. Commissioner's Court is constantly posting bonds and rewards for kids who've run away, and they've had to pay people to come bring them back, right? And lucky for me, sometimes they publish the kids' names, which is gold. So I will get to find out who these kids are. So there are kids resisting. There's also a few reports that there were riots and uprisings within these facilities in the 1930s. The superintendent of the Jockey home was actually fired in 1936 for not controlling the kids, and they removed the Jockey name in 1936 because they think it's misleading, because it's really a training school for girls, not a memorial home, right? So even the proprietors are like, we've got to change this. This is really a justice system thing, right? Not a school, and they start referring to them as inmates. And then we have these occasional references. So these are letters referring kids to the state training school for boys in Gatesville from San Antonio. And I blacked out the names, but the one on the left is a Spanish surname, and you can see that he's been arrested for marijuana possession. And the one on the right is an African-American boy, and we know this because it says colored after his name on the listing there. And he was charged with petty theft, essentially. He stole a bicycle and then stole a wagon, so therefore they're going to send him to this remote prison in North Texas. So these happy portraits, this noble aspiration, is it true? I am hoping to find that out. What I can take away from this is that, and I should add, there's a few things I haven't mentioned because I started rushing. I apologize. But the school for girls did not admit African-American girls at all, right? And the state school for girls did not admit African-American girls at all. So this problem is going to persist of no access to the programming all the way until World War II. And in the 1930s, the black community is actually going to start to complain about this. The NAACP is going to mount a protest against this. So the rhetoric and the reality of this, the promise of rehabilitation and education, right, is unequal. Thank you.
So what questions or comments do you have? You both have so many boxes here, both of you.
Number one, thanks for both panelists. Those were awesome, not just because you're my colleagues, because they were great papers. A question for Philis with respect to, we know we have the end of Reconstruction, right? We have the Civil Rights Bill of 1875 that drops integration of schools, right? But the question I have for you is then, so you have this school, the Rincon School that's built, right? Mm-hmm. How much pressure is there not only to have the school expanded, but how much pressure do you see from the community itself to try to integrate schools, right? To try to, is there any pressure that they just are going to accept the idea of segregated schools, or is there pressure from the schools themselves to say, we want more opportunity? And do those schools themselves, some of the colored schools, incorporate Mexican-American students into their population? Is there any kind of coordination in that area?
So there is a small dissenting minority in the black community that's basically, and they tend to have be Republicans. They never defected from the Republican Party. And the Republican Party itself is basically saying, you should have white teachers because that is, well, these black dissenters are saying that is promoting more integration, right? The Republican Party is saying you should have white teachers because we always have to kind of keep our thumb on the African American citizens now that they are enfranchised and have the vote. But by and large, the white teachers were very paternalistic and very patronizing. I mean, even some of the women who moved down from the north, they didn't believe in social equality. I mean, they didn't believe that all the races were equal. It was this very paternalistic, patronizing approach to teaching. So the majority of people in the black community, based on the evidence that I have found, really wanted to have black teachers because they felt like then we can have more control over how we run these schools. Now, what they didn't fully have control over was the curriculum, that it had to be this industrial, vocational training as opposed to, something more academic or classical learning. So they weren't really looking, a lot of people weren't really looking at it like, okay, this is really going to institutionalize Jim Crow and segregation. They were kind of looking at it like, this is going to be an opportunity for us to exercise some agency in how we educate our children without so much white oversight. And in regards to your question on Mexican American children, they did not attend the black schools, not in San Antonio. There were other parts of Texas where they did, and members of the Mexican community actually wrote letters to the Mexican consulate saying, hey, they're making us go to the black schools when legally we're supposed to be white. But in San Antonio, that wasn't the case. So.
Who else? Was there any friction between the black community and the Mexican American community at that time?
Yes.
And percentage-wise, I would assume that the black community was smaller than the Mexican community at that time,
Oh,
too.
absolutely, absolutely. The Anglo community was the largest community in the city, and then the next one would have been the Mexican community, and then the black community was the smallest one. When I talked about the coalition that formed the municipal political machine, one of the things that I left out just for time and kind of streamlining the narrative a little bit more was that there were members of the Mexican American elite that were involved in that coalition as well. So there was tension between some of these Mexican American elite and some of the black elite in terms of who was going to be able to have more control over the other. I mean, they certainly didn't form any sort of united front.
Did they have German language or bilingual education schools? And when you say Anglo were the largest group, does that include German Texans?
No, to answer your question about German language schools, there were some, especially in the New Braunfels area. I mean, in fact, the very first public school in the state of Texas opened in New Braunfels in 1856. It was called the New Braunfels Academy. And they did have bilingual instruction, which was really kind of mostly German instruction when I say bilingual. But I don't think that German Americans comprise the majority of the white population in San Antonio. I don't know what the percentage would be within the municipality, but there were many of them who were prominent citizens of the city.
So I had a question about the teacher training for the teachers who are going into these African American schools. We have a photograph in the exhibition of a group of teachers that have gathered on the steps of the Douglas School. What was teacher training like for these men and women? Was it also, just like their students, focused on vocational training? Or was this similar to what we're seeing with teacher training for Anglo teachers in the 20s and 30s?
That's a really great question. So the first group of black children to come out of that bureau school, the Lincoln School, kind of produced the first generation of black teachers in the city. And you kind of see that trend throughout the state of Texas too, not just limited to San Antonio, but that first generation of bureau students end up being that first generation of black teachers. In terms of professionalizing teaching as a profession, that doesn't really begin to become a thing until like the turn of the 20th century.
So in this earlier era, before 1900, you had cases throughout Texas, really, of people, not even really finishing high school, and yet they're a high school teacher somewhere, particularly in the county, in the rural county schools. So I don't think, and this is my educated guess at this point, I don't think that a lot of these black teachers that are teaching at the Rincon School in this era necessarily have bachelor's degrees or master's degrees. Probably at the most they have completed high school somewhere. If not here in town, then somewhere else in the state. But that, to be completely honest, I'm not sure.
This one's for Bill Bush. In your snapshot of the people who are going through reform and all that, blacks were way overrepresented. If I remember correctly, I mean it was approximately equal for Americans, quote unquote, Mexicans, quote unquote, and African Americans. Mm-hmm. And yet African Americans are a tiny, much smaller proportion of the city, which argues that what's going on here is a form of social control, especially given the notion, as you related, that clay is pretty hard and not reformable. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It actually replicates the pattern statewide almost perfectly, where African Americans, in terms of their numbers passing through this new system that's intended to protect kids from adult responsibility or adult consequences, right, is actually sort of funneling them into those adult consequences in a sort of more efficient way, right? So the kids that you see in that snapshot, right, I think there were like 14, they were the highest number, right, of that, just from that particular month. And I haven't had a chance to compile all of the sort of snapshot numbers that I have right now, but it's pretty consistent with that pattern. Statewide, same thing. So at the state institution for boys, they have a Jim Crow building, dormitory for African American kids, and it's very much like the school you described. It houses it's supposed to house like a few hundred, and they have like 3 times as many kids sort of packed into this building, and they're being leased out as convict laborers in the 1920s and 30s as well to local farmers. So that what I've found in San Antonio so far appears to mirror the state pattern in the same period pretty well. And I'll be interested to see if I can find what happened to those specific kids. How many of them were sent away to the state facility? How many of them were sent back into the community? How many of them were sent into the county jails? What happened to those kids? And since I have a few of their names, which I was not able to get when I did my statewide study, I can hopefully track them down.
Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, we can do it.
This is a bit of a question and also a bit of a comment. I've done a lot of community work in the last few years where the word Anglo is used to mean white, non-Hispanic. And this goes to this gentleman's comment about German Americans. We colloquially use Anglo as a term to mean white, non-Hispanic. My birth certificate says I'm white. I'm clearly Mexican American. But that distinction wasn't made in the 1950s. When you're looking at these documents and doing your research, is Anglo being used as a colloquial term because that's what we have customarily, up until recently, used in this region, or is it an actual term found in the historical documentation?
Well, when I look at historical documents regarding public education, the history of public education in Texas, it's not Anglo, it's American. It's always American, and ethnic Mexican children are always Mexican. There's no notation of whether they are Mexican American citizens or whether they're immigrants. They're just all lumped nationality Mexican. And white children are always listed as American.
And the two types of documents that I've worked with that kind of address that are crime records and then the census. Right, and the U.S. Census has kind of gone through various permutations. I'm sure several people in the room who've ever had to do research with the census in the 20th century know there are some years where it'll separate out kids by Spanish, or individuals by Spanish surname, but in many cases it's hard to, they don't make a clear distinction that you can really use. I mean, that's a challenge. right, in doing this kind of research is being able to identify those populations, because they didn't identify them very well. And now in the criminal records, they do distinguish them pretty clearly. So it's a little easier to track that down.
Well, we had better stop, but I just want to thank Phyllis and Bill again for giving us so much food for thought and doing some really fascinating primary research that moves us forward in our understanding of how these various communities interacted, and in the case of the ones that were talked about today, how they were controlled, either patronizingly or in other ways. So thank you again.